Political activist, author, linguist, Noam Chomsky is all of this and more. He's America's most outspoken critic of U.S. foreign policy and the mainstream media. Yet the New York Times has called Chomsky nothing less than the most important intellectual alive today. Over the years, his provocative views have inspired some and enraged others. Over the years, you've written about and given voice to an array of alternative views on issues as diverse as Vietnam and human rights and the role of the media. Your views traditionally tend to be a little bit more critical and outspoken, especially as it relates to U.S. foreign policy. I mean, I've got a quote here where you're saying that the United States is a violent and terrorist rogue state with no interest in the rule of law. I mean, that's pretty harsh stuff.
No, it's actually mostly based on quoting official documents.
Mm-hmm.
So the official U.S. position has been for years, even public, that, well, Dean Acheson put it pretty clearly about 40 years ago. He said, in cases where there is a challenge to the position, prestige, and power of the United States, the propriety of a response is not a legal issue. So in other words, we do what we want where there's a challenge. And in fact, and that's been reiterated very recently. So Clinton spoke to the United Nations a few years ago, and he said that the United States will act multilaterally when it's possible, but unilaterally if we feel that it's in our interest.
Mm-hmm.
And just last year, the Secretary of Defense, William Cohen, reiterated that even more strongly. He said the United States will take unilateral action in matters relevant to its interest, which include such things as access to markets and resources. And the U.S. is quite happy to use violent and terrorist means to do that.
But the notion of America being a violent, terrorist, rogue state, I mean, there seems to be a certain level of acquiescence to America's involvement right now. Often countries almost saying, you know, why don't you get more involved in Sierra Leone? Why don't you play your role as world leader of ensuring that you know, civil society is maintained throughout the planet?
That's not the U.S. role. The U.S. does get involved very extensively. So, for example, take a look at, say, arms flow.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good measure of involvement. If most of the arms flow is from the United States, it's the major arms producer and exporter. There are two countries, Israel and Egypt, which are always in the lead. That has to do with domination of the Middle East, so we put them in a separate category. If we look at the rest, the results are quite interesting. So, for example, right now, the leading recipient of U.S. arms in the world happens to be Colombia. Colombia also has the worst human rights record in the hemisphere and has had it for 10 years and has been the leading recipient of U.S. arms for 10 years. That's incidentally a correlation which is pretty well established over the years. Colombia moved in first place in 1999, replacing Turkey. What about Turkey? Well, Turkey's a military ally and strategic outpost, so it always gets a fairly high level of arms. It shot up in 1984, and it stayed very high right through 1998. In 1997, the flow of arms to Turkey was higher than the entire period pre-1984. Now, this had nothing to do with the Russians, nothing to do with the Cold War. What it had to do with is the fact that Turkey was carrying out a violent, murderous repression of its Kurdish minority, killing tens of thousands of people, creating 2 to 3 million refugees, destroying 3,500 villages, which is 7 times Kosovo under NATO bombing. And 80% of the arms were coming from the United States. Now, well, that's not creating... Now, well, why did it shift to Colombia? Well, the reason is because Turkey finally succeeded in repressing the internal insurgency. Colombia hasn't yet succeeded, so the arms flow is switching to Colombia. Well, now, that's not preserving civil society. That's maintaining state terror.
Well, and you've been very, very, you know, vociferous in pointing out the inconsistencies of U.S. initiatives based on human rights rationale, and that you believe that, for you take an example like Cuba, for instance, where the United States, well, we cannot support this regime because of the way they treat its citizens, yet in others it ignores. What's behind that? What motivates America, in your view, and it causes that inconsistency?
Well, first of all, I don't see it as an inconsistency. It seems to me very consistent. So it's consistently in support of what are called U.S. interests, which happen to be the interests of dominant sectors within U.S. society, which are primarily corporate interests. It's not a big secret. And it's not at all surprising. In fact, every state behaves like this. States are not moral agents. They may pretend to be, and intellectuals may produce flowery phrases, but the fact is states are institutions of power. Power often means violence. And they act in the interests of dominant social groups internally.
Now, in one of your recent books, The New Military Humanism, I mean, you focus on Kosovo. And again, you're very critical of the NATO and U.S.-led interventions into that country. At the time, that view, outraged many of what you might see as your natural liberal allies who saw Kosovo as a moral war. I mean, here was an attempt to stop, ethnic cleansing, mass genocide. What was your response to those people?
There are two problems with that. For one thing, it did not stop it, it initiated it. It contributed to initiating it. As anticipated, notice, the bombing led to a very sharp escalation of atrocities. That was anticipated. As the bombing began, the NATO commander, Wesley Clark, informed the press that it is, in his words, entirely predictable that it will lead to a very rapid escalation of atrocities. Shortly after, he informed the press that it was never the intent of the NATO command to put an end to ethnic cleansing or to stop atrocities, which of course is true because it led to an increase in them. So in the first place, in the narrow case of Kosovo, that was not it was not intended to stop atrocities. In fact, it led to an escalation of them. But there's a much more significant issue. If someone believed that this is a war fought for principles and values and humanitarian purposes and so on, there is a simple test, namely, what are you doing in other cases where you can very easily stop atrocities? So take, say, East Timor, the other big issue of 1999. In the early months of 1999, same time that concerns were being expressed about Kosovo and preparation for the bombing, right at that time, Indonesian commandos, trained and armed by the United States, were entering East Timor to carry out what they called Operation Clean Sweep, a mass intimidation and terror operation starting in February, which carried out extensive massacres, had killed maybe 5,000 people or so in the first half of the year, giving ample warning. This was an attempt to intimidate the population so that they would not vote for independence in a referendum that was being planned. They gave ample warning, open public warning, and much more has now come out through leaked Australian intelligence sources, that they were going to, that if the population voted the wrong way, they were going to carry out a mass destruction. Okay, the population voted the wrong way. They then did exactly what they said they were going to do. This is the Indonesian army and its paramilitaries, armed and trained by the United States and Britain primarily. And they then expelled about 85% of the population from their homes very violently and destroyed about 70% of the country. Well, what was the position of the United States and Britain during this entire period? They had an official position right to the end. The official position is it's their responsibility and we're not going to take it away from them. Okay, notice there's no sovereignty here, no issue of sovereignty, straight invasion. With U.S.-British backing, the Indonesian army had already killed about a third of the population, hundreds of thousands of people. Now here's a very easy way to stop atrocities. Tell them to call it off. You don't have to bomb Jakarta. You don't have to impose sanctions. You just have to stop participating in the atrocities. Stop providing the arms and the diplomatic support. Right in the middle, and I can go on case after case, in the middle of this performance, we have the people you're talking about complaining that I'm objecting to their pretense, and it certainly is a pretense.
Of a moral war.
Of a moral war. Now,
right.
How can you be carrying out a moral, maybe the bombing was right or maybe it was wrong. That's a separate question. But how can you be pretending that this is a moral endeavor while at the very same time you're participating in massive atrocities which are worse than those you claim you want to stop.
Well, I want to talk about even another case, because you've probably been most vocal in criticism of the bombing of northern Iraq and the ongoing sanctions in that country.
What's happening in Iraq is, well, first of all, what's happening in Iraq is that sanctions are being imposed, which are destroying the country, devastating the population, and strengthening Saddam Hussein. He's not suffering. In fact, his power is greater than before. And there's not going to be an internal rebellion when people are so demoralized and devastated that they can barely survive. That's the effect of it's exactly how many people have been killed, we're not certain, but it's probably on the order of 1 million, maybe. And the country has certainly been devastated. This was a relatively developed country, and it's been reduced to one of the poorest in the world. Now, this is the effect of the sanctions. Now, why is it being done? Well, there's an official reason. It's repeated over and over again. Every UN session, every public pronouncement, what is said is the following. It said, this man, Saddam Hussein, is such a monster that we can't let him survive. Why is he a monster? Not only did he develop weapons of mass destruction, but he even used them against his own population, the ultimate atrocity. All of that is absolutely true, but it's missing a few words. It is true that he developed weapons of mass destruction and used them against his own population with our support. Those are the words that are missing. With our support. The development of weapons of mass destruction was in the 1980s. The use of the gassing of the Kurds, which is what they're referring to, was in 1988. The U.S. and Britain responded to that by increasing their support for their friend Saddam Hussein. Increasing his ability to develop weapons of mass destruction, and by putting to the side, suppressing the mass murder of the Kurds. Now, that tells you something. It tells you, one thing it tells you is those can't be the reasons. They can't possibly be the reasons for the sanctions, because we were supporting him when he did these things, and continued to support him. So the reason, point number one is the political leadership. And that's not just the United States and Britain. It's the Netherlands, and every Western spokesman says the same thing. They're all lying transparently. The media and other commentators who are repeating this are not telling the truth. They're omitting the crucial words "with our support," which are very crucial. If we want to find out what's happening, we have to look elsewhere.
You've also been very critical about the media, and you've written extensively and given talks about how the media colludes with political leaders to both set the agenda and to maintain the status quo. Give our viewers some insight into how you believe that works.
Well, first question is, does it work? And I think the answer is yes. I can't give the evidence here, but just take the cases we've been discussing and ask how much has been presented about that, and the answer is virtually nothing. How does it work? It seems to me fairly straightforward. The media are part of the system of power. In the United States, for example, let me talk about that. What are the media? They're major corporations, parts of even bigger mega corporations like General Electric and Westinghouse and so on. Like other corporations, they produce a product and they sell it to a market. The market is advertisers, so other businesses, that's where the money comes from. The product is audiences. They sell audiences to advertisers. And for the major media, the ones that kind of set the agenda, like New York Times, Washington Post, and so on, they're selling privileged audiences. So you have major corporations selling privileged audiences to other businesses. What picture of the world do you expect to emerge from this system? Well, it's one that will reflect the interests of the sellers, the buyers, and the product.
Right. You've described this process in your landmark book as manufacturing consent. Give us a current example of where you might see that happen.
Well, take Turkey and Colombia. The transition from leading recipient of U.S. arms just last year was from Turkey to Colombia. Honest media would tell you that. They would say, look, we completed the operation of massive ethnic cleansing and atrocities in Turkey. We have not yet completed it in Colombia. So the leading flow of arms is shifting from Turkey to Colombia. If you look more closely, you find that's exactly what's going on. But that's not what's being presented. Turkey was barely reported. On the case of Colombia, it's reported, but under a pretext of a drug war, which can't possibly be taken seriously. This is not a drug war. I mean, this is a counterinsurgency operation attempting to destroy a peasant-based insurgency, which the government hasn't been able to control. That it isn't a drug war is obvious on the face of it. Abuse of lethal substances is a serious issue. By far the most significant, by orders of magnitude, is tobacco. That's by far the most lethal drug in international trade. In the United States alone, there were about 400,000 deaths, tobacco-related deaths last year, and 16,000 from all hard drugs combined. The Supreme Court recently just identified tobacco use as the leading public health hazard. Also, it's a huge international trade matter. Export of tobacco from the United States has increased about fivefold under the free trade regime. Other countries are compelled to accept U.S. lethal substances under pain of severe trade sanctions. Furthermore, they must accept advertising for them aimed at vulnerable populations, or else there are trade sanctions. Columbia Cartel is not permitted to put ads on CBS television saying, extolling the wonders of cocaine. Here is a major lethal substance, by far the worst, which is forced on other countries. Now, we can go on, but this is enough to show that it's not a drug war. It's a counterinsurgency war. And going back to the media, why is this presented under the pretext of a drug war? Like what I've just said is not secret information. It's quite public.
Yeah, I'm interested in how the media treats you, because the same media that ignores these issues, often, ignores or dismisses Noam Chomsky as, his views are so extreme. He's from Neptune. I mean, you've heard that before. I mean, what's your response to those?
Well, is it from Neptune to report what the Supreme Court just decided on the greatest health hazard in the United States, or to point out that was just a straight fact that the U.S. is using its alleged free trade enthusiasm to force other countries to accept lethal substances and advertising for them? I don't think that's from Neptune. That ought to be headlines. If the media do not want these to be headlines, that's something that they have to answer for. And incidentally, it's not me, it's every critic.
But you have been called the conscience of the American people. But I wonder in recent years, when what appears, at least on the surface, to be a growing consensus in favor of U.S. dominance around the world, trade liberalization, globalization, whether you ever feel like a lone voice out there.
Quite the contrary. I feel I'm right in the mainstream. So let's take, say, what's called trade liberalization, and that's not what's happening. What's called liberalization is, in fact, a complicated interaction of liberalization and protectionism in the interests of private power, but let's call it that. Who supports this? Certainly not the world, at least not if the people of the world count. So, for example, just last month, there were meetings of it's called G77. It's the non-aligned countries, basically. They account for 80% of the world's population. They had meetings right here in the hemisphere, in Colombia and Cuba, and produced a declaration of the South Summit, in which they bitterly condemned the process of globalization as it's being carried out, not because they're against globalization, but because it's being carried out in a way which is harmful to they see it as harmful to the population of the world. They called for a reorientation, which would aim at the right of independent national development, ending of poverty. The right of development, which they prioritize, is officially opposed by the United States. They condemned what they called the so-called right of humanitarian intervention, which they consider a guise for traditional imperialism under its familiar moralistic trappings. This is 80% of the world's population. Well, I did a database check in the United States. The declaration was not reported. That's 80% of the world's population. Well, let's take the United States and Canada. These are democracies, so we have polling and we know what people think. On the trade issues, the population is opposed. despite overwhelming propaganda. So the media are about 100% in favor of it, as is the entire corporate world, and there's very little criticism permitted. Nevertheless, on the issues, both the population of Canada and the United States have been consistently, pluralities have been consistently opposed, that is, of people who pay attention, the majority is generally opposed. That's not a marginal position, that's a position right in the center of opinion.
Well, we're starting to see, growing protest against a lot
We're seeing
of these.
Visible protests. But if you looked at the poll, like at the time of NAFTA,
sure,
despite, in the United States, which I know better, despite, I'd say 100% enthusiastic media support, public opposition persisted and remained a plurality. Now, to take part in that opposition is not to be marginalized. In fact, it's the media who are marginalized.
When you see this visible evidence of protest at the IMF, at the WTO, the OAS, do you see this as the worm kind of turning? Do you see the population starting to rise up against the status quo?
I don't see the worm as turning. I see the general opposition taking a more visible form. And it's been doing that for a long time. I mean, let's take the multilateral agreement on investment,
right?
Where there weren't big public protests, but there was plenty of protest, actually, initiated mostly in Canada. The effort was to ram this home in secret. It's a huge investor rights agreement, which they knew the public was going to be opposed to, so it was kept secret by the media, incidentally, for years. It broke through, largely because of Canadian activism, Maud Barlow and others. When it did break through, when it broke through the media self-censorship, instantly, very quickly, within a couple of months, there were protests all over the world. And the OECD, the Organization of the Rich Countries, had to back down. That's not, this is a matter of general public attitudes becoming harder to suppress.
Do you see the internet as providing an alternative means to get public views and forums discussed outside of traditional media?
Yeah, take, say, the multilateral agreement on investments again. I mean, the organizing for that was done mostly on the internet because it could not be done through the mainstream media. They wouldn't permit it. So it was done through the internet. A lot of the planning and organizing for the recent demonstrations has also been by getting around the mainstream information system or information control system by using this. The same's true in other countries, like take, say, Indonesia. The protests against the Suharto government, it could not be done in the Indonesian press. They were done, a lot of it was done through the internet. It was an internet organizing system. And in fact, whether this will continue or not is a real matter for struggle. We know certainly what the corporations want. They don't want it to be used for information and activism. And if the public is willing to struggle to maintain control of what it created and not to hand it over as another weapon of domination, well, then it'll remain that way. But it's not going to happen automatically.
Now, over the years, you've been involved in a broad spectrum of issues. I'm interested, what's consuming you right now? What's really your passion these days?
Basically the same issues. I mean, issues of human rights, democracy, freedom, justice. There's been a major attack on democracy in the last 20, 25 years. That's in fact a large part of what's called globalization. What's called globalization is a kind of a cover for the shifting of decision-making away from instruments of popular sovereignty, like governments in the more democratic countries. In the more democratic countries, that means the public to some extent at least. Shifting of decisions away from them into private tyrannies, which is what corporations are. You can call them something else if you like, but they're private tyrannies. So as decisions are shifted to investors, lenders, banks, manufacturing corporations, and so on, which is what globalization is, in fact, this form of it, that is an attack on popular sovereignty. And it's intended that way. So financial liberalization, which is a big piece of the current globalization system, that creates what's called sometimes a virtual parliament, which has veto power over national planning. It can exercise that power simply by attacking currencies and withdrawing capital. And that constrains what governments can do. And in more democratic states, that means it constrains what people can do. It means you can't carry out social and economic planning which will be aimed for the welfare of people rather than for profits. Because if you do that, there will be an attack by the virtual parliament. That's a major consequence of financial liberalization, and it is understood. Back in the 1940s, when Britain and the United States, Keynes and White, created the Bretton Woods system, it was based on stabilization of currencies and control of capital. And these were the quite explicit reasons for it. It was to allow governments to carry out national socioeconomic planning without fear of the virtual parliament. When this system was dismantled in the 70s through state initiative, the United States, Canada, Britain, and others, that led to a major attack on popular democracy. That's only one example. Incidentally, this form of globalization that's been instituted also has harmed the economy. So if you look at, say, growth rates, they've been, for the less developed countries, they've been cut by about half during the last 20, 25 years. For the industrial countries, almost as much, cut by maybe a third. And the same is true of other macroeconomic statistics. In fact, what's called a fairy tale economy in the United States, a Goldilocks economy, it's a fairy tale for a very small number of people. For about 80% of the popular workforce in the United States, wages have stagnated or declined and work hours have greatly increased. Now, that's an unprecedented failure of the economic system, especially during a period of moderate growth in the last 10 years. These are all aspects of globalization, if you like, that of a particular form of globalization. Well, you know, these are things that I think that most people do care about, and to take part in that general opposition to the form in which private power and government power is directing the world, I think that's, as I say, I don't think that marginalizes one. It means you're right in the center of things.
Well, it's clear that you're as motivated as you ever have been about these things. Noam Chomsky, I want to thank you very much for joining me. It's been a real pleasure.
Okay.